Now, you make wine all over the world. What pulls the portfolio together? What connects it all?
The underlying principle is a deeply held belief, which is that any great wine, first of all, has to come from a remarkable vineyard terroir. I do like to be making wines in wild and beautiful places, and it just happens to be that many of the most beautiful vineyards in the world happen to make rather wonderful wines. I think it's really important never to lose a sense of wonder about these things, and in my case, a sense of wonder that I'm actually here.
You get paid to do this every day. Welcome to the Wine Podcast. I'm Suzanne Mustacich, your host, and today I'm so pleased to introduce you to Christian Seely. He's Managing Director of AXA Millésimes. So he's making some of the finest wines in the world, in Bordeaux, in the Douro, in Burgundy, in Tokaj, in Napa and Sonoma. And he's also the co-founder of Coates & Seely, an English sparkling wine vineyard in Hampshire and now Isle of Wight. So Christian, welcome to the Wine Podcast. Thank you for joining us. Now, you make wine all over the world. So let's give our listeners just a snapshot of where you make wine.
Okay, well...
Because it's a long list.
Yes, it's a fairly long list. So I'm actually based in Bordeaux at Château Pichon Baron, which is where the head office is. Here in France, we have Pichon Baron, we have Château Pibran, we have Château Ducru-Beaucaillou, then we have Domaine in Burgundy. Right. In Hungary, we have Disznókő, where, of course, we make Tokaj, and then in the Douro, Quinta de Noval, where we make ports, but increasingly more and more dry red wines and dry white wines. Mm-hmm. In America, we have Outpost Vineyard at the top of Howell Mountain, where we make great Cabernets, but also some rather exciting Zinfandels. And our most recent acquisition is actually Platt Vineyard in West Sonoma Coast, where we're making Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays. So
when you're managing estates in different countries, how do you differentiate? Or do you think in terms of grape variety, terroir, location? I mean, that you've got quite a portfolio. So, yes. I mean, a lot of different grape varieties, although you did mention you've got the Pinot Noir and Chardonnay from Burgundy and now California. But what pulls the portfolio together? What connects it all?
The underlying principle is a deeply held belief, which is that any great wine, first of all, has to come from a remarkable vineyard terroir, but that any great wine it will achieve its full greatness if it is the unique individual expression of that vineyard terroir. And I don't think that you are going the best way about obtaining individual expressions if you try to manage a group of wineries with a group winemaking policy. And so it's the management style is extremely decentralized in that what I try to do is, first of all, make sure I've got some fantastic vineyards, but then within each vineyard have some fantastic teams who are encouraged to manage those vineyards in a fairly autonomous way, not entirely independent, but autonomous. I have people working with me in the various vineyards who are all remarkable professionals, whether they are vineyard managers or enologists, or whether they're technical directors who might have knowledge of both areas. And I encourage them to devote their time, and some of them devote most of their lives, to looking after the vineyards they have in their charge, and every year to try to pursue the dream of making the greatest wine that vineyard might make from its terroir in the circumstances that nature gives us. In the end, that ends up making wines that are significantly different from each site. So I'm quite satisfied that we don't have a group winemaking policy, except for the fact that we'd like everyone in each individual vineyard to make individual wines.
How often do you have to go visit during the harvest? That must be quite...
I visit a lot, all the vineyards. I spend a lot of time traveling around the vineyards. It's not that my presence is really very vital to ensure that people do their jobs, because the people who are there know exactly what they're doing. That's why they're there. But it is actually, I think, very important if you're responsible for these vineyards and these wines, which ultimately I am, to be very aware of what's going on and to visit very regularly. Apart from that, it's a huge pleasure.
So how did you get your start in the wine trade? Because I believe almost your entire career has been in the wine trade.
Well, enough for it to be.
It feels like it. Anyway, yeah.
I've been running vineyards at this sort of level for 33 years now. So, it really all started when my father was a wine writer, and when I left university, he invited me while I was coming to terms with the terrible shock of leaving university and realizing I wasn't going to be able to spend the rest of my life just reading poems. He said, well, look, while you're coming to terms with reality, I'm off to write a book in Bordeaux. Why don't you come with me? And so I basically took 9 months off to work with my dad, and we came here to Bordeaux, and he wrote his first book, The Great Wines of Bordeaux, and it was the most fantastic baptism of fire. He was a great taster and knew all the wines very well. For me, it was just a discovery, and I tasted a lot of wines in 9 months. And above all, I just fell in love with this world. I came back thinking somehow or other I must make sure I work in this world.
So it sounds like you're as passionate about it today as you were when you started. Is that true?
Yeah, I think so, and perhaps even more. But because it kind of grows on you. But I still find it as exciting as I first did. I live in the Medoc, and I drive from my house in the wilds of Listrac along the Route des Châteaux. And I remember when I first came with my father, looking out the window and saying, "Oh, that's Ducru-Beaucaillou," and I still do that, and it's my drive to work. And
it's one of the most beautiful roads in France. Yeah, it's gorgeous.
And I just find it a very exciting and moving experience. And I think it's very important never to lose a sense of wonder about these things. And in my case, a sense of wonder that I'm actually here.
You get paid to do this every day. How's that? Yeah. Is there any place, any wine region in the world where you're not making wine that you would like to make wine?
Oh, yeah, plenty, but one has to accept certain limitations of time and space. And I'm very excited by our recent acquisitions in California. And the latest wines we've been making in West Sonoma Coast are just thrillingly exciting.
Okay, well, tell us about that. Tell us about the vineyard. Tell us about what makes it special. So West Sonoma, so you're right near the Pacific coast.
Exactly, and that's the key to everything. So first of all, I do like to be making wines in wild and beautiful places, and it's not an exact correlation, but there are. It just happens to be that many of the most beautiful vineyards in the world happen to make rather wonderful wines as well. And in the case of Platt Vineyard, we're surrounded by 1,000-year-old redwood forests, and it's incredibly beautiful. But from a winemaking point of view, what's very interesting is that you have an awful lot of sunshine. Many days of sunshine every year, but cool temperatures, because we're only about 5 miles from the Pacific Ocean, which is quite cold water, and it's a reservoir of coolness right on our doorstep, and we get a lot of mists rolling in from the sea. And so the combination of cool temperatures and consistent sunshine is absolutely perfect for making great Chardonnays and Pinot Noirs.
That's just what I was thinking when you were describing. I thought that's why he's turned to Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. So how many bottles do you produce there? How much?
We make 4 wines. So we make 2 Pinots and 2 Chardonnays.
Okay.
So there's the in Chardonnay we have the estate wine Platt Vineyard Chardonnay, and then we make the estate reserve, which is made in a considerably smaller volume, which comes from certain parcels that are just produce something remarkable in that year. I say this as if we'd had a long-term strategy, but we actually bought it in 22, and our first wine was made in 23. So far we've only made 3 wines. Basically, we have an estate wine and an estate reserve, both for Chardonnay and for Pinot Noir.
And you make one with old clones, correct? A Chardonnay?
We have some old clones, and then some of our vineyard is for Pinot Noir, for example. We have quite a lot of Calera, and that gives just magnificent results. You know.
Okay, and then not very far away, but inland, you have Outpost.
Yes, so Outpost was our first acquisition in California. Our search in California started in 2016 when I presented the idea to my my board at AXA Millésimes that we should make an acquisition there. They went along with the idea. The logic being at that time, with Pichon Baron, we have one of the great Cabernet-based wines of the world. And I thought, wouldn't it be logical and fun as well to go to Napa Valley, the other place in the world where Cabernet finds a great expression, but a totally different expression, and try our hands at making great Cabernet over there. And so I spent 2 years looking, actually, which was great fun. Not all the time, but just from time to time, I'd fly out to California and look at sites to buy. And because we're quite a large organization, quite a lot of the sites I was shown were exactly wrong, because they tended to be rather big, with enormous wineries, large vineyards, and big names sometimes. But what we were looking for was something that we recognized as a great vineyard terroir. And I like the mountain vineyards very much, but when Outpost came up, which is just this extraordinary volcanic site at the top of Howell Mountain, and I tasted the wines, which are very individual expressions of the different parcels we have, I realized that I had arrived at my destination.
And it's at altitude, 550 meters, 1,800 feet? Is that interesting?
It goes a little higher, actually. It starts at 1,800 feet and it goes up to 2,500, I think. So.
What's the impact of farming at that altitude on the aromas? Do you get a freshness? Are you going to get cooler nights?
Generally speaking, it's cooler, but we tend to get warmer mornings because in the valley floor they have fog, which keeps it cool in the morning, whereas we don't. On the other hand, we get cooler afternoons, and that's absolutely key. And there have been recent years, 2022, for example, which was rather a hot year. It was extremely hot on the valley floor, but we, because of those cooler afternoons, we were going to harvest later anyway, and we actually got 2 weeks of relatively cool sunshine in September to finish off getting our Cabernets ripe. Howell Mountain Cabernets in 2022 have a very specific freshness, which is quite atypical of the year.
Okay, so you're convincing me that you have extraordinary terroirs that you're working at. So it seemed natural to me to go to the monopoles in Burgundy, because that is quite extraordinary as well. So talk to us about Arlo.
Well, Arlo is above all known for the fact that it has two Premier Cru monopoles, Clos de l'Arlo itself and Clos des Forêts Saint-Georges.
And that's rare. It's rare to have a monopole.
It's quite rare, because the idea of a monopole, for anyone who isn't familiar with the concept, is that in Burgundy there are many marvelous vineyards which may have very many proprietors within that vineyard, and many of them will make great wines. But one vineyard like Clos Vougeot, for example, there will be many producers making quite different expressions from that vineyard. But if you own the whole vineyard, it's called a monopole. For obvious reasons, you have the monopoly over the ownership of the land, and also any wine bearing that name is made by you. And so we have two, which is rather a wonderful thing. So Clos l'Arlo is actually, it's quite small. It's 4 hectares, although that's quite big in Burgundy.
Does it have a wall around it?
Yeah, that's the one. And that's unusually for Nuits Saint-Georges. It's half white and half red. There's quite a bit of limestone soil. As you know, anywhere in Burgundy you can have totally different soils very close to each other, and so within our 4 hectares you have half that is very suitable for white and half that's very suitable for red. And then in Clos des Forêts Saint-Georges, which is a magnificent 7 hectares, which is rather gigantic in Burgundy. Up until recently it's been entirely red, but we've been replanting part of the vineyard, and we just took a look at the geological survey of what we had under the soil, and actually there was just over 1 hectare at the top of the vineyard which was seriously limestoney, and we thought, let's replant those reds as whites. So we've got quite shortly we will be having within our monopole at Clos des Forêts, we'll be starting to produce a white wine there as well, which is very exciting.
That will be very exciting when you launch that. Now you have another tiny holding, Romany Saint-Vivant.
Yes, we do.
Which is tiny, quarter of a hectare?
It's just slightly more than that, but yes.
Okay.
But that's a very exciting piece of land to have.
Why is that exciting? Tell us what makes it special.
It's always the case with these great vineyards in Burgundy that they express something unique and special about the place they come from. But when you enter Grand Cru vineyard in Romanée Saint-Vivant, that's something special. It's extremely special. And
how hard is it to buy a vineyard there?
It's very difficult indeed now. We actually bought that not at the same time as we bought Arlo. We bought it a few years later at probably the last moment when it was still possible to buy the vineyards of that sort at a vaguely reasonable price. The demand for those vineyards is extraordinary for very good reason. There's a very, very small amount of vineyard terroir of that quality in Burgundy or indeed in the world. And there's a long list of people who'd like to buy some. But anyway, we're lucky enough to have the bit we have. And it makes the most astonishing Grand Cru wine. We're actually right next door to the DRC vineyard, and they are on the other side of the road. So if you actually go and visit and you go into the next door vineyard to take a picture of DRC, which a lot of people do, you're standing in our vineyard now.
So making wine in Burgundy must be quite different than making wine in Bordeaux.
Yes.
Just the size alone is, because Pichon Baron is over 70 hectares, right?
Well, it's actually in total it's 92 hectares, but
exactly.
and
So the scale alone makes it's got to be a slightly different mindset, is it? Or tell me, how is it different?
Well, I think Burgundy and Bordeaux are in many ways very different places. So if ever you're living in Bordeaux and you think, oh, this Bordeaux world, it's getting on top of me a bit, you can just you don't have to leave France. You just can go to Burgundy and you're in another country, and that's wonderful. Not that I ever particularly want to leave Bordeaux. I'm always very happy to come back again. But of course, there are many dissimilarities. Principally, that the great red wine of Burgundy is from Pinot Noir, and the great white wine is from Chardonnay. Whereas here in Bordeaux, we tend to blend, and there's a considerable flexibility for each property, what they plant and what they use to make their blends. This is a profound difference. But there are also many similarities. This is something I notice all over the world. Obviously, the conditions are very different and mentalities are different everywhere I go and everywhere I work. But on the other hand, the fundamental realities are the same everywhere. And one tends to talk a lot about the nuances of terroir in Burgundy for a very good reason. First of all, because you're expressing that with a monocepage, and so it's easier to say and to explain that the differences come from the terroir. Undoubtedly, the notion of terroir is absolutely vital in Bordeaux as well. And the best test of this, I think, is to look at an individual vineyard like Pichon Baron, where we make our Grand Vin, which is a selection of usually on average about 42% of our total production. And consistently, the Grand Vin tends to come from certain parcels, notably the Grand Plateau right next to the chateau, which is just overlooking Chateau Latour. I always mention this just in case anyone doesn't not quite sure where we are. And then we make two second wines, Les Tourelles and Les Griffons. And Les Tourelles tends to come from parcels of land that are slightly further inland with a totally different soil makeup, much less gravel, and more suitable for Merlot. So our Tourelle is actually usually about 65% Merlot. And then we make another second wine called Les Griffons. Again, a terroir selection among the second wines, which is more based on the Cabernet Sauvignon grape. And so we're making three principal wines at Pichon Baron, all three quite different in style, and different in style because of the different places they come from within the vineyard, and they're all made by us. So it's a really accurate way of showing the differences that you get from individual terroirs. So even though both winemakers in Burgundy and Burgundy lovers tend to think, this is the place where terroir finds its finest expression, and perhaps they're right about that, but it's an equally central concept in Bordeaux as well.
And it's because they're also dealing with smaller smaller amount of land, smaller surface. But in Bordeaux, in a large estate, you find those individual terroirs, identities within the estate, which is what you did with the white wine you're making too. You did a master selection from Suduiraut.
Yes,
we have white, this is which really, I loved.
Well, I'm glad you liked it. This is really good fun. So we decided to make a white wine at Pichon Baron a few years ago. We don't actually, unfortunately, have very much soil that is exactly what we want. We've only got 2 hectares of limestone soil where the limestone's exposed because there was a sort of land slippage between two places, and the limestone, which is underneath most of our vineyards, actually, but usually quite deep down. In this place is at the top. So we took some 20-year-old, actually 24-year-old Merlot vines and grafted them with a Marsal selection of Sémillon, which we were, of course, very able to choose the best thing we wanted from Château Ducru-Beaucaillou. Grafted that Sémillon onto the Merlot vines, and hey presto, you've got Sémillon from great vines in Ducru-Beaucaillou growing on a limestone soil in Pauillac, and it's producing a rather thrilling 100% Sémillon wine. I think at this stage still at the only 100% Sémillon in the Médoc, but I'm sure there'll be others, and called Les Griffon Blanc.
And now, why did you? I loved it, and I loved the 100% Sémillon. But is there a reason why you chose not to do a white blend? Because you have that option.
Yeah, of course we have that option, and we do at Château Ducru-Beaucaillou, where we're increasingly making a range of really thrilling dry white wines. We make 3 dry white wines: Les Lions de Ducru-Beaucaillou, which is usually around 55% Sémillon, and the rest Sauvignon Blanc and a bit of Sauvignon Gris, actually. And then we have the Grand Vin Blanc Sec of Château Ducru-Beaucaillou, which is we launched in 2020. That was the first time we'd ever dared to take grapes from the old vines in the Grand Terroir of Ducru-Beaucaillou, which before would have been exclusively reserved for making the great sweet wine. And we just decided to pinch some of those grapes, if you like, to see whether it was possible in a Premier Cru Sauternes vineyard to make one of the great white wines of Bordeaux. And well, in the first year we were trying to convince ourselves first, but we did that. And then after that, we've had a very thrilling time with this wine. It's had a great critical success and commercial success too. And I think we're beginning to show that Sémillon-based wines can make some of the great dry white wines of Bordeaux, but also that some of the top Sauternes properties are able to make some of the great dry white wines of the world. So that's very exciting. And to go back to your Sémillon question, we also make a pure Sémillon at Château Ducru-Beaucaillou, which is just about 2,500 bottles, but from very old vine Sémillon. And that's a really thrilling wine that we only launched in 2020 as well. But that's a wine that it's magnificent when you taste it, but as soon as you've tasted it, you say, that's magnificent. I must lay it down and wait for 10 years, and so we'll see how it develops. But it's a very exciting one.
I've tasted it several times in the lineup, and I agree. Some of the top and most exciting dry whites coming out of Bordeaux are coming from the Sauternes estates. I think it's a handful of wines, or a dozen maybe, but they're extraordinary and they're really exceptional. They're excellent. They're really,
who would have
excellent.
thought it?
Exactly, and yet there it is, right here. Well, let's talk about another exceptional white wine you make in Tokaj, which is one of my favorites, actually. So not everybody who's listening is going to know about Tokaj. So talk to us. I mean, they should. It's a travesty if they haven't had an opportunity to taste it yet. I've been there. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. And how they make the wine, the sweet wine, is incredibly labor intensive. Explain Azu winemaking, and I can even pronounce it.
Putoños.
Okay. How do you explain what it means? What does that mean? What does that represent other than a huge amount of work?
Okay, so at Disznókő, we are very concentrated on the production of the great Azu wines, principally the 5 Putoños and the 6 Putoños, for the simple reason that we believe those are the greatest wines that the Tokaj region actually makes.
And historically, these were some of the most famous wines, the most sought-after wines.
Yeah, they were. They
have an incredible history.
The favorite wine of Louis XIV, who said, "This is the king of wines and the wine of kings," which is still Tokaj's motto. Tokaj was the favorite wine of the Tsars of Russia, who used to have their lips embalmed with Tokaj essentia on their deathbeds to give them a foretaste of paradise, which is
it's extraordinary.
It's not so bad.
And okay, so went through a bad period though during the communist era, right?
Yes.
That's when the state had, what do you call it? When they'd taken control of all the production, correct? And they were churning out a lot of just very basic wine.
Yes.
Correct. Okay. Then their buyers come in, the communism falls. They bring in private investment.
Yes.
AXA buys in 92.
That's exactly right.
Right. Okay. So not very far. When in 89 was the fall of communism there. So
yeah, and so they had a couple of years, very, very tough time, because before they'd, under the Comecon system, they'd been exchanging bulk Tokaj with the Soviet Union in return for crude oil, which is not perhaps the most refined way of marketing your
So it was
wine.
Just a commodity within the communist.
It was treated as a commodity.
Okay.
And then suddenly there was no Soviet Union, there was no market at all. And so they had a bit of a problem. The then director of the state farm, who, remember, had grown up within the communist system, had the extraordinary visionary idea to open up the ownership of some of the vineyards by inviting in Western producers who the theory, which actually has turned out to work rather well, was that the few investors who would come in would act as a sort of yeast to make the whole of Tokaj rise by investing in their vineyards, making great wines again. That would then follow that the rest of Tokaj would rise with them, and it's exactly what's happened.
And it's a small region. It's not very big.
No, but there's quite a few producers now. But anyway, we bought into that at 1992, and we really had the choice of a vineyard to buy, and we chose Disznókő, and it's just a magnificent Tokaj property, the equivalent of Premier Cru in Bordeaux. To come back to the wines a little bit, you asked about 5 and 6 Puttonyos. Yes. Well, so Puttonyó is Hungarian for a wooden bucket, which used to be the method of harvesting the asu berries. And the asu berries are the either shriveled or botrytis berries that you pick towards the end of the harvest. And they would be collected in these wooden buckets. Bucket would contain about 22, 23 kilos. And that would then be mixed with dry white wine, which would have been made earlier. The Tokaj asu method is unique, as far as I'm aware, in that you basically make, there are 2 fermentations. First of all, you pick the grapes which are not going to shrivel up earlier on. You make a dry white wine with them, and you then later on, when you pick the asu berries, you macerate them in this dry white wine, and the extraordinary richness of those berries makes the wine ferment a second time. It's a very complex winemaking procedure. It gets even more complicated because we don't always macerate the asu berries in made wine. Sometimes we macerate them in dry white wine in fermentation, and that gives a slightly different result. But anyway, the principle is the same. And a Puttonyó was, as I said, a bucket. It was the ratio of the number of buckets you would add to a small 120-odd litres in a traditional Hungarian barrel, how many of those buckets you would add to the equivalent of 1 barrel of dry white wine. And those ratios still hold today. Obviously, we don't use wooden buckets, and the barrels are a different size, but the ratios are still the same. That's how it works.
And those wines, you sell them around the world?
Yeah, we do. The slightly frustrating thing about being a Tokaj producer is that I'm often asked, well, where do you sell this? And I say, well, actually, your country is one of my best markets. And that's perfectly true about the United States, by the way. And I think the United States is one of the most promising of all the export markets because American consumers tend to, I think, are the most open-minded in the world. And if they read about a wine and hear that this is a great wine and it's worth trying, there's a good chance they're going to have a try.
So my experience with Tokaj is when I bring out a bottle of Tokaj, they don't my guests don't necessarily have ever had it, they've never heard of it. Often they're American. again, open to new wines. They love hearing about the history of it. And they're like, okay, great. If this is supposed to be one of the best wines in the world, I want to taste it. And they love it. They love it. So for me, it's one of those wines that once people taste it, they want more of it. But It is hard. I realize that's your job, is how do you get them to try it that first time?
We have some excellent distributors for Tokaj for Disznókő in the United States. And so getting a quality distribution who will work on getting the wines into quality outlets, especially on trade, it's absolutely key. But as you say, when somebody tastes Tokaj, if it's the first time, it's a revelation because it's a very unique wine. You have this. These extraordinary aromas that are quite unique of things like white peaches and apricots and all sorts of other very spicy and wonderful things. And above all, with wines that are so rich, you have an extraordinary minerality and freshness to them as well. So that even with wines that can sometimes be as high as 200 grams of residual sugar, they almost finish dry because of that linear acidity that you get from the purity of the ferment grape. So there's just something very unique about these wines. They're thrilling to drink, and the key, as you say, is to try it once. Once you've tried one once, it's very unlikely you won't come back for more.
Okay, next, I would like to go to where you started your career, Quinta do Noval,
yes,
Portugal, which I've been to, tasted many of the wines, absolutely beautiful. And it's what can you tell us about the place, its location, the Douro, and why that's unique? Because the Douro, of course, undulates, right? Mm-hmm. So all of the elevation, the exposition is going to be really important.
Yes.
Okay. And you have Nacional, a monopole, again. That seems to be a theme. You have these really beautiful, smallish plots, not so small, I guess, but you're working with really these very unique terroirs and trying your very best to do something extraordinary with it. Yeah,
that's exactly the idea.
Okay, so Nacional, tell us about Nacional.
Well, let me talk about Quinta do Noval.
Okay.
Just to put it into context. So Quinta do Noval is right in the heart of the Douro. It's an emblematic estate of representing the finest of what the Douro can do. It's 200 hectares of vineyard, which is it's a big vineyard. And you were talking about expositions. We have expositions within that vineyard, north, south, west, and east, and we have altitudes ranging from 130 meters above sea level to 575 meters above sea level. So you have an extraordinary diversity of expositions, heights, and terroirs, which enable us to we do a lot of very precise work in the vineyard and do a lot of quite small vinifications, and so we have an awful lot of lots, whether it's wines for making port or wines for making red or even white wines. We have an awful lot of lots to work with when we're making our blends. So Quinta do Noval is an extraordinary place, capable of making some of the very finest ports and red and white wines from the Douro. But we also have at the heart of this vineyard the Nacional parcel, the principle of which is rather different, because whereas Quinta do Noval is a large vineyard with many different parcels, the Nacional is a tiny vineyard, and it's basically one parcel. It's 1.6 hectares of vineyard, and it's the only place where ungrafted vines survive and produce wine in the Douro, and it produces a vintage port, which is quite unique. Always, when we make a vintage port from Quinta do Noval, it's a very strict selection. A vintage port declaration from Quinta do Noval can be as little as 5% of our total production. We're just selecting the very, very finest wines from the best performing parcels in any given year. And the Quinta do Noval vintage port is an outstanding vintage port and does extremely well in the tastings. But when we make the Nacional, it is always completely different. And if you taste the two together, you say, okay, this is different. It's not always necessarily better. And we've had a few years where one of our breakthrough years, quite soon after I started, was the 97 vintage, where Robert Parker, who was still tasting then, gave 100 points to the Quinta do Noval vintage port and also to the Nacional vintage port. And we thought, that's about right. They're different, but they're the same level of quality. But the personality of the National is quite different because ungrafted vines behave differently. They have different aromas. They have much lower yields. There tends to be a more profundity, complexity, and concentration in the National. And the extraordinary thing about it being so big and powerful and reserved as a young wine is that it also has a remarkable finesse. And so a great National vintage port is, if you're a vintage port lover, you just got to try one once in your life. And they're almost immortal. I've opened very ancient Nationals, and the 63 National, which is one of the legends of Quinta Noval, is still quite a good brick red colour, and you think it's pretty good, but maybe another 10 years to get to its perfection.
And are both Quinta Noval and National, are they field mixes, field blends? Do you still have a blend of different?
So the National parcel is entirely a field blend, and within the Quinta Noval vineyard we have several parcels which are field blends, some of them very old, going back to the 1930s, and we also have several parcels which are mono-varietal plantations planted with Touriga Nacional, Touriga Francesa, etc. And so both for our vintage ports and for our top red wines at Noval, we found that the best balance is to have a proportion of the wines made with the purity and elegance that the monovarietal plantings can give, with the profundity and complexity that you can get from the old vine field blend plantings, and that can be quite fun working that out.
And how many varieties do you think are in those field blends? Do you know? Have they?
We've counted them, and each one is in all our field blends. Each vine is mapped, and we actually have little labels on each vine, so you can walk along and have a look. And so it's there's more than 50 permitted red wine varietals in the Douro, but we have in most of our field blends, it's usually around 35 different grape varieties planted.
And do you think that's helping you in terms of climate change or anything? Do you think, what is that? Why keep the field blends?
Well, because they work, because they give we have field blends because they work, and we have monovarietal planting because that works as well. But one of the many interesting things about field blends is the surprising resistance to very hot conditions. If you think about how a field blend works, you might have 35 different varieties planted in a parcel. Normally, if you've got one variety planted in a parcel, you go through, you taste the grapes, you analyze them, and you think, right, today is the right day for picking this. With a field blend, you can't do that because all those varieties will ripen at different times. So inevitably, the moment of picking, you try and get the moment where the largest number of your varieties is actually ripe, but there will be a significant proportion that are slightly riper than ideal, and you will get a significant proportion that are slightly less ripe than ideal. And so it shouldn't work, but it does. And not only does it work, but it works magnificently. And you get the combination of all these different vines working together gives you sometimes quite astonishing results, and especially I think it's partly because you've got a proportion that perhaps aren't quite ripe yet within the blend that can give them remarkable freshness even in very hot conditions.
Is it my imagination, or do we have more declared vintages in the last, say, 15, 20 years than in the past?
You have more declared vintages at Quinta Noval, and that is just because, as I explained, we have 200 hectares with all these different expositions, and it's extremely unlikely that we are not going to have some parcels within that vineyard ranging from 130 metres above sea level up to 575 that don't produce something really exciting in any given year. The key, though, is if you're going to make a declaration, an eccentric one, which when is not everyone else is declared, first of all, you have to be absolutely sure that it's extremely good, otherwise you'll be shot down in flames. And secondly, you have to be prepared to make a very tiny declaration. And I've made declarations from Noval where we only produced 900 cases, which represents, and that year it was 2014, that was the lowest, it represented under under 3% of our total production. So it's not like we're being greedy, wanting to make lots more vintage port. We just want, if we have wines that we believe are vintage quality and are worthy of standing in a vertical lineup of Quinta Noval vintage port, we want to make those wines. And if that means making a tiny, tiny declaration, so be it. And we do.
Now, tawny port's completely different. I get questioned by people when I've been in Portugal and I'm doing some tastings with some friends and stuff, is understanding what is the characteristic of a 10-year tawny, a 30-year tawny, a 40-year tawny. Often they seem to think that, oh, it's 10 years old. Like, well, no, not necessarily. There'll be wines that will be 10 years old in there, but there might be older ones, might be younger ones.
Yes.
So can you just explain for the tawnies you make, have you set a profile that you're looking for each, the 10-year, the 20, the 30, the 40? And then how do you come up with that?
I think above all, there's a Noval profile. The old tawnies of Quinta Noval, they don't all the wines that go in do not all come from our vineyard. Where there are some that, because we have some very good suppliers. Basically, the rule is if a wine says Quinta Noval on the label, it comes 100% from the vineyard.
Okay.
So our Quinta Noval vintage port, 100% from the vineyard. Our Quinta Noval red wines, 100% from the vineyard, and our Quinta Noval collieters, the dated tawnies, come 100% from the Quinta. But our 10, 20, 40, 50, and shortly 80-year-olds do not necessarily entirely come from the Quinta. So we, and once they're very old, we don't even know how much came from the Quinta. So we don't put Quinta on those wines because we don't know. But there is definitely a house style with our tawnies, and it's primarily the personality of the Noval vineyard that determines that. So I would say that the Quinta Noval old tawny ports tend to be, there tends to have a remarkable freshness. The colour tends to be a little darker than most. So you might compare the colour of our 20-year-old with the colour of somebody else's 20-year-old. You might think, oh, this is quite there's quite a lot of red still here. But that's the nature of our wines. They hold their colour and they hold their fruit quite a bit longer than one might imagine. So there's definitely a consistent house style. And then in terms of the blends, as you say, when we make a 10-year-old tawny or a 20-year-old tawny, there is a sort of average age that is slightly more than 10 or 20 years. But if we just made our 20-year-old from one vintage 20 years ago, it would mean that our 20-year-old tawny would be different every year because it would take the character of the vintage. Whereas in our 20-year-old tawny, there are wines that could be 16, 18, 19, 20, but then 22, 24, 26 years old. It's that kind of range. And what we're trying to do with a wine like that is to create a consistent house style so that if you buy a bottle of Noval 20-year-old tawny port and you think, oh, that's rather good, then next year when you come back and buy another one, you're not going to, above all, you're going to notice this is the Noval 20-year-old tawny that I recognize. There will be subtle differences because the blend is always moving a little bit, but essentially it enables us to maintain a house style. And we try to do that across the range, whether it's 10, 20, 40 or 50. And it's an absolutely fascinating process to blend those wines. And we do it with a 10-year-old, we do it at least twice a year. What you're trying to do, for example, if you're blending a 10-year-old, we obviously taste the current 10-year-old on the market first. But if you blend a 10-year-old that tastes pretty exactly like the 10-year-old that's on the market, you're not doing it right because the wine will actually go on the market in 6 months' time. And so if you make it the same as the 10-year-old today, by the time it gets on the market in 6 months, it'll be 6 months older. And so you have to try and make a blend that will taste like your current 10-year-old in 6 months, and that's super fun as a blender. It's probably one of the most fascinating exercises there is. So
when you're doing that blend, how many samples do you have in front of you? How many cast samples? How many do you have? 50?
Yeah, it can be at least 50 with the 10-year-old. It gets to be it gets to be slightly fewer as the wines get older for obvious reasons.
Oh, that must be really interesting. Now you own a vineyard as well. You make sparkling wine in England. It started in Hampshire. I believe you've expanded now to the Isle of Wight.
Yes.
Tell us about that. Tell us about how. First of all, how is it going with the English sparkling wine market? It's developed a lot.
Yes, it has.
Over the last 20-some years. Yeah. Is it being recognized in markets outside of England? And how has that been for you as an experience to own your own vineyard?
Well, it's been wonderful. It started off, Coates and Seeley started off very small. So it's a business that I started with an old friend of mine called Nicholas Coates, who lives in England. And we started the business together, made our first wines in 2009. So it's been going a while now, 17 years old. And at the beginning, we had a few acres of rented land that we had vines on. We actually found some vineyard that was already planted with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and so that got us going quicker than we thought. But we then, the business grew faster than we expected it to, actually, and we bought a neighbouring farm and planted out our own vineyards in Hampshire, and then just a few years ago now, we found the most extraordinary vineyard site in the south of the Isle of Wight, and we bought that and we planted that now. So we now have a total of 50 hectares under vine, just about, which is we've moved quite fast from our initial beginnings, and I think neither of us expected it to grow so fast. The real thrill of Coates and Seeley at the beginning was really opening the first wine, because if you buy a vineyard or you start a vineyard anywhere else in the world, you're normally making wine in an area where you know what the next door people are making, and you know probably what the vineyard you own was making before. But this was completely virgin territory, and we thought, will we be able to make a great wine here or not? And obviously you have to wait quite a few years before you know, because you need to give the wine between the harvest time and the time it's disgorged. In for a brut non-vintage, it's at least 3 years, and usually, in our case, usually 4. And so that day that we opened the first bottle was incredibly moving, because I was absolutely terrified, actually. Yeah, because
it was a huge relief.
But it was an emotional moment, because I thought, oh, this is going to work. This is this is absolutely delicious. And so from then on, it's grown rather fast. We're now distributed in 9 countries, including the United States of America. We do sell some bottles in France, it has to be said, which is really we're very proud of the bottles that we sell to some quite smart restaurants in France. Scandinavia is very strong. We're making some inroads in Asia as well. So it's a very exciting thing. I think above all, the thing that's really thrilling is this notion that in the southern parts of England, you have certain parcels of land, of which we happen to own 2, where you have this combination of chalk and clay in south-facing protected slopes that is capable, first of all, geologically more or less identical to what they have in Champagne, but is capable, if you're very careful about your viticulture and, of course, your winemaking, of making sparkling wines using, we call our wine méthode britannique, but it's the méthode britannique is remarkably similar to the méthode champenoise, I have to say, and it's capable of making sparkling wines using the great varieties of Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Chardonnay that are among the greatest sparkling wines in the world, and I'm absolutely confident that that's what's happening now, and I think that there are great things to come, because obviously it's getting a little warmer and progressively. So for us, it's been a marvelous adventure. It's always a great adventure to start a business and make something happen. But it's been a wonderful experience, and still is a wonderful experience, to be part of something that hardly existed before. In the case of our vineyard, did not exist before, and will probably exist forever now, because these are vineyards. When we planted the Isle of Wight vineyard, I remember planting it all out and standing at the top and looking at the vineyard, and you look over the sea, and I thought there's never been a vineyard here before, and perhaps there always will be one here now, and that's a rather nice feeling.
And your family has ties to the Isle of Wight as well.
That's where my family come from. Yeah,
that's wonderful. So last question: if you were going to throw a dinner party for anybody, past, present, who would you invite? Where would you hold it? What would you pour?
Okay, so I studied English and French literature at Cambridge University, which was why I couldn't work out what to do when I left university. So I'm going to go for literary guests and past ones, really, because this is my only opportunity to get to meet them, apart from through their works. So I'd start off with Henry Fielding, who the author of Tom Jones, who for me is for me, that's the greatest of all English novels, completely encapsulates a whole English universe a long time ago in the 18th century. But he was a wonderful man. When he died, his cousin said, it is a pity he was not immortal. He was so framed for happiness. And that comes through in everything he writes. He's got this most extraordinary humanity and sense of humour. So I start with him. And then after that, I would have to go back a bit and go, you have to have William Shakespeare to see what he'd be like, really. And Ben Jonson, who is a friend of his and a great feaster. So those are my three more ancient ones. Moving up to being a bit more modern, another colossus would be Henry James. I think I'd go for Robert Louis Stevenson, who's a magical man whose picture hangs in my room at Quinta de Noval. And then, I better have some women, don't you think? And I think one of the problems with some of the female novelists, they tend to be rather moralistic. So I think if they came to dinner, they might not approve of me.
Anais Nin, just for your diarist.
Well, I would have Dorothy Parker, who I'm certain would be fun, and I'd try and make sure she had 4 martinis, of course, and then George Eliot, who of course was very moralistic, but she had her private life gives me hope that she might have been more tolerant than she appears to be sometimes in the books. Who else? Joseph Conrad, and I think I'm about there.
And all together at the same time.
All together at the same time, absolutely. Yeah. And I'd have them all. I'd have them to dinner at home, because I like to do these things at home. Plus, I can just serve all my own wines without any nonsense about corkage. And I'm very, very simple. I just start with lots of oysters, then a turbot, then a rib of beef, and then a large gorgonzola cheese. And with that, I could go through the white wines that we make at Suduiraut and in America and at Quinta de Noval. Then I would be having all the AXA Millésimes red wines. And then once you've got a big gorgonzola cheese, you can go crazy with Sauterne, Tokaj, and vintage port. And I'm sure we'd have a good time.
That would be fantastic. Okay. Well, if there's space for a modern writer. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Thanks for being on the Wine Podcast.
Thank you very much. It's been great fun, Suzanne.